History 1. I work deliveries in a really fancy neighborhood in the hills of California. The properties stretch out along steep canyons and cliffs, so the roads are narrow and the driveways go straight up and down. I was pretty new to the job and really enjoyed all the different aspects of it. Driving all day, seeing beautiful places, unique houses, and meeting different people. This story happened before COVID, so delivery work was a bit friendlier and not so scrutinized. One day I had a particularly large shipment to deliver, and because of the layout of the neighborhood, I was getting it done at a snail's pace, maybe even slower. I got a few packages mixed up and found myself turning around more than once. The addresses on some of the homes were hidden by all kinds of nonsense, so finding some places was nearly impossible. I didn't have a GPS to help me out. This was quite a while ago. I pride myself on being a low-stress person, so I just took it one day, 1 mile, one package at a time. I did my best to lose myself in the scenic views and radio hits, which honestly isn't hard to do out here. As the day wore on, I found myself with a rapidly dwindling load of mail, but the sun had dipped, and I realized I was now working overtime. We usually had to check this out with a supervisor, but I'd already gone over an hour at this point and I only had a few parcels left, so I just decided to finish up. Because I was late, I started driving a little quicker and going right up to the houses instead of stopping at the end of the driveways. The less walking I did, the better, especially with the long driveways. I got the address for the next drop and started driving out into a darker area of the neighborhood. There were only a couple of houses out here, and only 1 or 2 of them actually had lights on. These homes were the biggest out here, multi-million-dollar places with all kinds of crazy outdoor setups. I passed a gate, took a turn, and found myself driving up a very long, lonely driveway up a hillside. When I got to the top, the house was absolutely stunning. There was a multi-car garage and what looked like a guest house above it, then a terrace connecting it to the house, and then this grand mansion towering above the cliffside. My first thought was, what could this person have ordered that they don't already have? The package was mid-sized and kind of heavy, but I'm not nosy, so I didn't shake it or anything. I walked it up to the door. Because it was late and the house was so out of the way, I didn't bother ringing the doorbell. With my luck, it'd be some celebrity, and I'd disturb their private dinner party or something. As I turned and started heading back toward the van, one of the garage doors opened beside me. Light spilled out and illuminated the driveway. I turned to see a pair of headlights coming up the pass. They slowed to a stop when they saw me and then parked, jackknifed in front of the exit. I thought it was kind of weird, but then it occurred to me they might have security up here. I did pass through a gate, so maybe someone was coming to see what I was doing here, especially so late at night. I had already delivered the package, so I figured everything would be easy to explain. The door opened, and out came this tall, decently built guy. He wasn't threatening or anything, just had his hands in his pockets as he checked out my work van. When he saw the very recognizable logo, he nodded and seemed relieved. I said hello and explained that I'd been behind all day. He said it was all fine. He didn't know who I was and explained that he was having issues with trespassers on the property, especially over the last few months. I said how crazy that seemed to me, considering how far out of the city we were, how isolated the cliffsides were. He smiled and said, "Yeah, it is crazy, but so are the people who keep showing up." I laughed, but he didn't react, just stared at me with this weird glare, as if I was one of those people sneaking around his property. Awkwardly, I told him to have a good night and started to walk back toward the van. He stopped me and said, "Don't I have to sign for that?" I shook my head and said no, not necessarily. He insisted, certain that I was making some kind of mistake. He kept staring me down with those dark, dead eyes. For as well put together as this guy was, his demeanor was legitimately scary, like crazy scary. I looked over the spotless, blacked-out SUV he had just driven up the hill, and then it hit me. He had to be on some kind of drugs. I asked him if he could move his car, to which he corrected me, saying it's more like a truck. It had 4x4, a lift, all kinds of aftermarket additions. He then asked me if I wanted to see them, to which I declined. Now I was getting seriously weirded out. Every time he spoke, He took these little, almost unnoticeable steps toward me, and before long he was only a couple of feet from me. He looked over my van and asked about the specs of it. I worked for the delivery company. I didn't know anything about the van. He nodded and then did a lap around it, then started telling me what he thought about it. He complimented the suspension and then criticized the paint, but he said he understood. It was a car on the clock. Speaking of clock, I really needed to get out of there. I asked him if he could move his truck again. He nodded but then held out his hand. He asked if I had that paperwork for him to sign. Oh my God, you have to be kidding me. This guy was like coked out, obsessed with the notion of having some kind of receipt. I went to the van and wrote a slip for the package out of sheer desire just to get out of there. The whole time I was writing, he was still circling the van, telling me all kinds of weird stuff about it, like the preferred gasoline and how easy it'd be to cut the brake lines. Now I was starting to sweat. I could see through the veneer of his wealth, and what I saw was a total creep. Bad teeth, bad skin, eyes so dark that they were sunken and totally blended in with the dark night sky behind him. I signed the sticker and handed it over to him. He looked it up and down and nodded but didn't sign it. He asked me if I knew why he wanted that, and I told him no. He looked me in the eyes and said, "Just in case anything bad happens to you, I can tell them that it didn't happen here. It's got the time you left and everything." He pointed to the camera on the corner of the garage but didn't turn to look at it, just made the gesture. He said his signature lined up with the time on the security system of when I left. I smiled and said, "Thank you so much for your concern. I appreciate all the extra measures." He laughed and said it was for him, not me. So now, if I drove away and got raped and murdered and thrown off the cliffside, he wouldn't be involved in the investigation. It was like his alibi. These were his words, and he was now closing the last few steps between us. I backed into the driver's seat of the van, but he was so close I couldn't even close the door. I started to panic, and the emotions rolled across my face. He stopped, laughed, then patted me on the shoulder. "Don't be so anxious," he said. "A job isn't worth getting stressed over." He backed up and then closed the door for me, tapped on the glass and waved. I slammed the key into the ignition, secured everything in the van while he moved his car, and then parked it in the garage. I remember turning around and casting one more look at this guy. He was just standing there in the light of his garage door, hands still in his pockets. When he saw I was looking, he pointed up to the camera, then tapped his watch. I've never driven faster in my life. No idea if this guy was coked up, a psycho, or just messing with the delivery girl. But from there on out, I was not as friendly with people I delivered to. History 2. This actually happened 2 weeks ago, and I don't think anything will ever top this experience for me. I had gotten a new delivery location as we totally rotated regions within the station and other DSPs. I got into a town an hour and a half away from the station with only around 90 stops. This was known as a cakewalk delivery region, so I was actually kind of looking forward to it. Everything went well. I finished the town deliveries, and so far everyone I encountered seemed to be incredibly kind. This was until my last 10 or maybe 20 stops, which were rural and then outside of that town. When I mentioned this to my last delivery, he wrinkled his nose and told me to be careful. Some of the locals were nothing but trouble. I was a little excited at this prospect. What kind of weird activity would I get a front row seat to? The stuff in my head was way funnier than what I actually encountered. People were well beyond poor, but actually cratered into poverty. Some of the kids watched me drive by. It seemed like they'd never seen a delivery van before. I got to an address way out in the boonies. As soon as I entered their driveway, it was filled with random garbage everywhere. Microwaves, chairs, washers, dryers, wheels, everything you'd think you'd find in a dump. I was certain that I was going to end up popping a tire driving through all this stuff. I drove all the way into the driveway to find that there was no house, just a small place to turn around in. I ended up turning around, confused about where this house could be. As I was driving out the way I came, I slowly looked around to find anywhere just to leave this package. I spotted this small shack, probably half the size of my van. I was just going to go tuck it in the inlet so it wouldn't get wet if it rained. I didn't expect anyone to actually be inside this desolate little hut. But as soon as I got close and set the package down, a dude who looked like he hadn't showered in months or even changed clothes came out with a hunting knife and a gun tucked inside his belt. That startled me, so I started stepping back a bit, thinking of ways to retreat to my van without getting stabbed or shot. My van was a good distance away since I parked it on firm ground, and that shack was on marshy grass. I also thought running would definitely escalate the situation since the guy came out asking me who I was and why I was on his property. I explained that I was with Amazon and he had a package. He shouted back that all of that was impossible. He didn't have Wi-Fi, a computer, or even a cell phone. He didn't get packages out here. I replied maybe a family member or a friend could have sent him a package, but if he didn't want it, I could take it back. He went on to say all of his family is dead, then asked if I wanted to know how they died. I replied back with, "No, I'm okay," and that I was just going to leave the package. This upset him more. He then told me people who drive unmarked vans out here get shot. At this point, I'm thinking this dude is going to take his gun out. So I asked him if he knew why we had to use white vans instead of our Amazon-branded vans, which surprisingly seemed to de-escalate the situation. I explained that some of the white vans have four-wheel drive for the hills and the dirt and gravel roads up here, and the Amazon-branded ones don't. I'm honestly just trying to talk my way out or de-escalate it, whatever I have to do at this point. Then the guy tells me to wait. He has a surprise. He goes back inside his shack. Again, I'm thinking I need to fast walk to my van, but he comes out and tells me he needs his box. He wants to trade me something for it. I declined and told him I would just leave it on the ground for him to take. I didn't need anything. I said it was really time for me to get going because I had a million other deliveries. For whatever reason, logic then seemed to speak to this guy. He goes on to produce this huge Ziploc bag of what looks like meth crystals and weed, all shaken and smashed together. He told me, "You can have it." I don't know how I just noticed this now, but when I looked to the guy's right, I noticed something hanging up from the wall. I couldn't believe my eyes at first, but sure enough, it was a dead dog strapped to the overhang. It was mangled and decaying. It had clearly been up there for a while. It was beyond horrific and really put the situation in perspective for me. I looked back at the guy who's shaking this big bag of meth and weed. I told him, "I'm good, man. I'm on the job right now." He then pointed his knife at me and started to approach. At that point, I just turned around and started walking back toward the van. He said he just wanted me to take his knife and open the box since he thought it was a bomb. He was sure the box would explode if he opened it, so he wanted me to do it instead. I sliced it open in 2 seconds, then sprinted back to my van. I had actually made it out of there without getting knifed or shot, although I might have contracted something from touching that knife. I drove up the road a bit until I was a good distance from that hut, then had a total mental breakdown. It was just some of the craziest stuff of my career. I just let the anxiety wash over me as I replayed what the hell just took place. I made a statement with my dispatch, and they sent it to OTR, but apparently Amazon didn't deem what happened bad enough to blacklist the address, unless I made a case number with the police. I didn't want to get that involved, so I just let it go. Once I transferred to a new region, we all just watched for that lot number now, expecting someone else to have to go pay him another visit. History 3. This happened back in 2016. I work for the USPS delivering mail in the Midwest. I've been at this job for around 5 years, and let me tell you, I've met some pretty unique individuals. To give you a little context, I don't look like your typical mailman. I'm a guy around 6 tall, 195 pounds, covered in tattoos, with long blonde hair and gauges. Folks often say I don't look approachable, but I'm friendly and kind to everyone I meet, especially on the job. Now, about the incident. I had just started a new route, and being low on the seniority totem pole, this route wasn't exactly in the nicest neighborhoods. Toward the end of the day, I'd finished my deliveries on a long stretch of road with run-down houses, most of which looked either vacant or barely livable. With only a few deliveries left, my last package was for a Mr. Thompson, and it looked like medication from the VA hospital. Being a fellow vet, I figured we'd get along just fine. Mr. Thompson's trailer was down a narrow dirt path with a few other trailers around it. Since it was my first day on this route, finding the right trailer took a bit of time, especially since they weren't labeled with numbers. Most of the other trailers had trash and random junk lying around, with smashed windows and graffiti. Only one looked somewhat livable, so I guessed that was the one. I hopped out of my truck and headed up the steps, gently knocking on the door. Footsteps approached before the door yanked open, revealing a huge man about 6'6" or 6'7", easily over 300 pounds. He bellowed out a booming, "Yeah?" I quickly stammered, "Hey sir, I have a package that needs a signature for Mr. Thompson." He replied, "Oh yeah, that's my father, but I can sign for it." Since it's common for family members to sign for each other, I handed him the slip of paper. He fumbled with it, trying to find a surface to write on, and I immediately smelled the booze. This guy was hammered. It took him way too long to scribble a name down. He handed the slip back and I gave him the package. "All right, have a good evening, man," I said, ready to call it a day and have a few drinks myself. As I was leaving the porch, he yelled, "Hey, is that Michael the Archangel and Lucifer tattooed on your arm?" I turned around, chuckling. "Yeah, it is." He told me he had a painting in the garage that looked exactly like my tattoo. Thinking it was a bit random, I replied, "Wow, that's crazy, man. Cool." I turned back to my truck, but he called out again, "You want to see it?" I really didn't want to, but I mumbled, "Sorry, man, I need to get back to the office." Before I knew it, he darted to the garage and insisted I come in, holding out his arm in an after-you motion. Against my better judgment, I found myself stepping inside. The garage was pitch black, with windows covered in newspaper. The whole situation felt sketchy. He closed the door, plunging us into complete darkness. I muttered, "It's kind of dark in here." He chuckled. "Yeah, give me a sec, I'll get the light." A few moments later, he pulled a string on a tiny light bulb, barely illuminating the garage. The floor was covered in empty liquor and beer bottles, trash, and rusty tools. He walked to the back room of the garage, standing at the threshold with a sheepish grin. "It's back here, come take a look." Red flags were going off like crazy. I knew better than to walk back there. I've been in sketchy situations before, but something about this guy was just off. His mannerisms and presence creeped me out. I needed an excuse to get out, so I pressed the enter button on my scanner, making it beep loudly. I pretended to get a message from my boss, saying he needed me back at the office ASAP. "Shit," I said loudly. "My boss needs me back. Sorry, man. Another time for sure." I backpedaled out and lightly jogged back to my truck. As I glanced back, his grin was gone, replaced with a stern, pissed-off look. Back at the office, I told my supervisor what happened. He agreed it was weird and creepy, but couldn't understand why I went into the garage. He told me if I was uncomfortable, I could notify Mr. Thompson to pick up his packages at the post office. I felt bad about making an older vet go out of his way, but I didn't want to encounter his son again. From then on, that's what I did. Maybe he had that painting, maybe not. Either way, I don't give a damn. So to that drunken Ed Gein look-alike, I hope we never meet again. History 4. I grew up in Florida through the late 70s and 80s. This was during the era of the cocaine cowboys and numerous unsolved murders. Back then, Florida was like the Wild West. I remember headlines comparing the homicide rates of Miami and Los Angeles to see which was more dangerous, and it was often a tie. My dad worked for the post office back then and got me my first job as a mail carrier. It was a pretty straightforward gig VDJ, just taking letters to mailboxes and bigger packages to doorsteps. I liked it for what it was. I got to drive a 4-door Cutlass with air conditioning and a radio, which were true luxuries for my 16-year-old self. Being able to listen to whatever music I wanted while making a few bucks felt amazing. My dad didn't work as a mail carrier anymore because he'd been with the post office for so long. He worked in the main building, fully promoted to desk work and scheduling logistics of every kind. That said, he had worked the beat for many years and knew the ins and outs and the dangers one could encounter while delivering mail. My dad always made sure to emphasize how careful I needed to be and which neighborhoods required me to be on high alert. One day in early summer, I was across town delivering mail like usual. The neighborhoods I was servicing were outliers, what most city folks called rural. This is where you'd start to see dirt roads and the beginnings of small-town life. Out here, most of the folks had their mail delivered to big communal boxes with little slots for their addresses. I didn't like having loose mail crates in the car, so I'd always start with these to get those deliveries out of the way first. If the mail slid around, it was much harder to deliver, so I kept it organized by destination in the bins. As I was filling up one of the boxes, a car drove by. I turned and waved with a big smile, as many of the people I delivered to had come to know and like me. But I didn't recognize this car. It had the kind of look you'd see downtown where the money lives, VDJ, dark windows and shiny rims. It wasn't just a cool car, it looked like something a gangster would drive. To my 16-year-old brain, this thing was certifiably pimp, which was a big deal back then, especially in Florida. The car gave me a weird feeling. It was definitely out of place out here in the boonies, and it didn't seem friendly. Maybe it was an undercover cop. A few of my friends' dads were cops, and they told stories about detectives driving cool cars and carrying better guns. I kept an eye on it as it rolled down the road, careful not to stare. I didn't want any trouble. Like I said, this was Florida, and things were crazy. My dad's warnings about how bad things could get echoed in my head. My brain raced with notions of hitmen and human trafficking. I did my best to focus on the mail so I could finish and move on. I felt very vulnerable with my back to the street. The car was almost out of sight, but then it stopped. It lurched with the transmission and slowly rolled backward into a driveway before turning around. Now it was coming right back at me, and I had only a few letters left. I'd taken a few karate classes back then and knew breathing techniques to help focus. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't preparing to throw a spinning back kick if needed. The car rolled up and kept going. It was an older couple, from what I could see, wearing their Sunday best and completely lost. They waved and drove back the way they came. I finished the mailboxes with little incident, but the slowness of that dark sedan had triggered my fight-or-flight response, putting me on edge for the rest of the afternoon. This experience stuck with me for the rest of my life. After living in Florida, personal security became a huge priority for me. After I finished the mail there, I had one job left, VDJ, delivering bigger parcels to doorsteps. Fortunately, there were only a few that day. My system was simple. I'd go to the furthest address first and then work my way back. That way, when the last drop-off was done, I'd be close to the country roads that would take me back to town. The first address had a shoebox-sized package, nothing heavy, but it was in one of the neighborhoods my dad had warned me about many times. I wasn't nervous, but I was on high alert after my encounter with that weird car. I just wanted to be done with the workday. When I got to the first house, it was deep in the thicket of trees and brush shrouding my view. The entire property was lined with a tall fence, and the gate was secured with a no trespassing sign. I shrugged and started to turn the car around when I saw a second sign dangling from the first saying, "Mailman okay?" I parked the Cutlass on the side of the street, grabbed the package and one other thing before getting out VDJ, a canister of pepper spray my dad had bought me when I started the job. He insisted I keep it in the car or my pocket just in case. He'd carried one for years and had to use it a few times himself. I slipped it into my pocket and made for the gate. It had a simple latch system. I considered leaving it open just in case, but decided against it. Between my karate skills, youth, and pocket full of mace, I fancied myself pretty unstoppable. I casually walked down the driveway until I spotted the house VDJ, a ramshackle dump that screamed of criminal activity. Half-stripped cars in the yard, a cracked front window. It could have been just poverty, but it felt like more. I knocked and got no response, so I left the package by the door. The house was private enough that theft wasn't a concern. As I turned to head back to the car, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, VDJ, a big ugly dog staring me down. It came out from under one of the cars, looking starving and pissed. This didn't deter me at first. I'm a dog guy, always have been. I tried to relax and reached out a hand as a peace offering. The dog didn't like that. It charged at me, all teeth and eyes, literally frothing at the mouth. Mailman okay was a sick joke. Did I just get lured into some hillbilly's idea of a practical joke? As the dog barreled toward me, I realized my mistake. I wasn't indestructible, and this dog was way bigger than I first thought. I had only one option left, VDJ, the pepper spray. I pulled it from my pocket and aimed it at the dog. The problem was the dog didn't care. It had no idea what I was holding. I hit the button and watched as a misty cloud filled the air VDJ, but not in the right direction. In my panic, I had turned the nozzle, aiming it between myself and the dog. We both got a face full of chemicals and retreated, rolling around in the dirt, howling for help. No one was home, so no one came. After a while we recovered, but only in the sense that we weren't crying and screaming. Neither of us could see or smell. I knew the dog would be royally pissed and still interested in tearing me apart. I rolled to my right to create some distance, feeling the dirt change to grass beneath me. I got to my knees, my vision shot, but I could see outlines, shapes, and colors. I saw the stripped cars in front of me, the dog off to the left. For almost 30 minutes I tiptoed across the yard, trying not to draw the dog's attention. I couldn't run, as tripping would alert it. I walked slowly and calmly, stopping whenever I got too loud, until I reached the fence. The dog eventually started sniffing around the yard for me but couldn't get my scent. It got close a few times and I'd freeze until it moved on. Once I was free of the yard, my trouble wasn't over. How was I going to get the car back to the post office? I sat on the bumper, rinsing my eyes with water for an hour or two, but it didn't help. Finally, someone pulled up beside me and asked if I needed help. This time I didn't get suspicious when I heard the car tires. They contacted my dad at the post office, who came out and finished the deliveries. The car got home, and my dad laughed at my swollen eyes the whole rest of the weekend. History 5. The pandemic forced a lot of folks to look for new jobs and opportunities, especially when the economy took a hit. Companies like Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Amazon saw a huge surge in traffic when cities ordered everyone to stay indoors. Many places deemed these drivers essential workers, which kept me employed during several unstable months. I became a delivery driver out of necessity back then, and I still do it part-time on weekends. My story takes place in 2020, when no one knew what the future held. I was working for a big-name delivery company in one of the largest cities in the United States. At the time, I was constantly behind by at least a day's worth of deliveries, if not more. There were strikes going on, and people were ordering more stuff than ever. It was a lot to handle, making for a high-stress work environment. I remember seeing a meme about how all we do is pee in water bottles and lose packages. Honestly, it was the golden age for delivery driver memes. Because I was so behind on my route, I started working overtime almost every day. Instead of delivering from 9 to 5, I'd start at 8 in the morning and go until I was totally burned out. Usually around 7 p.m. Maybe a little longer if I had a Red Bull that day. One evening I had one last package to deliver. I thought about saving it for the morning, but I was close to the address and decided to just get it done. The parcel was no bigger than my fist, and I didn't want it spending the night in my truck. I wish I hadn't been so stubborn. Why didn't I just go home like I wanted to? The essential worker tag was going to my head. I pulled up outside this apartment complex. I'm talking chalk lines on the sidewalk, caution tape rippling in the breeze. Not literally, but you get what I mean. Groups of guys were patrolling the parking lot, milling around dark corners. Big dogs were barking from every tiny gate, bullet holes in some of the cars. It was one of the seediest, most unsightly parts of the city. I scanned the package in my hand and left the truck to find the actual address. Luckily, it seemed to be a ground floor unit, so I didn't have to climb 10 flights of stairs just to deliver this bulk chapstick or whatever it was. I locked the truck behind me, just to be safe. There was nothing in it to steal, but this neighborhood wasn't worth the gamble. After wandering around, I found the building and finally the unit. It was a dingy corner apartment with windows covered in tin foil, movie posters, and cereal boxes, VDJ, you name it. The second I saw it, I got a weird feeling, but hey, I was almost done for the day. I walked around to the front and found a guy leaning against a tree smoking a cigarette. I gave him a nod and he offered a 2-finger salute, VDJ, standard guy exchange in my city. I hit the bell and placed the package on the floor. As I stood up, the door ripped open with agitated energy, VJ, every driver's nightmare. The irritated panic where you have to deal with someone acting like they're a cop. As I got upright, I saw this guy was different. He was rail thin, half-dressed, and covered in what I assumed were track marks. Dirty and unwashed, the living room behind him was disgusting. We made eye contact, I said hello and turned to leave. "What the hell, man? I've been waiting for you all day," he shouted. I turned back, shrugged, and offered my usual apology. "Hey, we're understaffed, man. What more can I say? I think I saw you drop my package." I stopped. I had no idea what he was talking about. I pointed to the package at his feet and asked if he meant that one. "Yeah, man. I watched you throw it against the door. It's probably broken." I started to argue, but it was a racket. The guy behind me, smoking a cigarette, was a friend of the guy in the apartment. The apartment guy asked, "Hey, did you see him do it?" And of course, cigarette guy nodded. "Yep, saw the whole thing." This was turning into a real problem. Not just them trying to report me, but being surrounded by potentially dangerous criminals. They tried to usher me inside to work it out, but I followed my own protocol. Never get forced to go anywhere, especially on shift. The apartment guy pulled out a gun from his pants pocket and pointed it at my face. The entire conversation stopped, and we all stared at the trigger. He asked me to reconsider going inside, saying it was just a big misunderstanding. The cigarette guy put out his smoke, grabbed my elbow, and led me in. My heart was pounding through my chest. Anything could happen. Once we got inside, the guy with the gun put it away quickly, seeming nervous to have it out, which was a relief. But the scariest part was over. The whole situation devolved into an episode of The Three Stooges. They tried to call my office for 15 minutes, too strung out to look at the phone for more than a minute. From what I gathered, they had run out of whatever they were addicted to and were filling their cravings with whatever they could find. To say they were high was an understatement, VDJ. They looked like they hadn't slept in days. That's when they came up with a scam, thinking they'd get a payout from me. They'd seen videos online of drivers dumping packages over fences and ordered something small and cheap off Amazon, waiting at the door for it to arrive. They were completely crazy, thinking they were going to get cash from me in the middle of the night. I couldn't understand the logic, but I appreciated the desperation. I encouraged them a little, just to see how far they'd go. Trying to get them to focus on the phone was the funniest part, but I had to keep it reasonable. They did force me in there and had a gun, so it wasn't all fun and games. Something caught their attention in the back of the apartment. They both snapped to it, reacting to something I couldn't see or hear. Probably typical hallucinations from staying awake for so long. One turned the kitchen drawers upside down looking for a flashlight, while the other yelled, keeping an eye on the dark hall. They didn't find a flashlight but held cell phones. I told them both their phones had flashlights, and they went nuts at this realization, frantically flicking them on. They told me to keep an eye on the front door and watch their backs. I nodded like we were old war buddies, promising not to let them down. As they went down the hallway, I shuffled back to the door and unlatched the deadbolt. The last thing I saw was the glare of their phone lights against the dingy back wall and the shaky silhouettes of the pistol going from one room to the next. I wasn't out of the woods yet. I still had to get back to my truck in the sketchy complex and navigate my way out of the slums and back to the city. It was much later than I thought, and all I wanted was to get home. I went from a walk to a light jog, not wanting to draw too much attention. Everything was going smoothly until I reached the parking lot and heard something behind me. I still don't know what it was, but it sounded like someone running up on me. I whirled around, but no one was there. Now I was hearing things. As I turned back to face the parking lot, I stepped into the angled antenna of a car nearby. It had been bent at the base, jutting out instead of going straight up and down. That antenna was perfectly level with my eye, pushing right beneath the lid and behind my actual eye. I harpooned my own face in a mad dash to get out of this place. There was no grace in my reaction. In panic, I flailed backward, injuring myself worse. The antenna had a bead on the end, putting pressure between my eye. The metal rod must have been inside my eye at least an inch or two. When I pulled back, it slid out the same way it went in. The pain was beyond measure. Blood droplets leaked from the base of my eye. I was within 15 feet of my truck, but couldn't see the keys to open the door. I stumbled to the back and sat on the bumper, holding my eye and praying it didn't fall out. After 45 minutes, my vision cleared a little, but the pain was still explosive. I managed to get back into the truck and slowly drive home. We didn't have to return the trucks if we were behind. We just swapped them out for new ones in the morning. My eye didn't fall out, but I needed some pretty involved doctor visits for 18 months after that. I like to think those crackheads are still holed up in that apartment, looking for a phantom burglar. They probably don't even remember taking me hostage.